think that's Dan's domain.
Dan, you have a specific strategy?
I think if you embark on activities that have some degree of risk that you are unprepared for or you think you're unprepared for, one of the only options you have is to have a tremendous responsive capability so that if a risk manifests, whatever risk that may be, you have the ability to respond and to recover. Because it is clear in the question that risk mitigation has probably not taken place. So it's that responsive capacity that becomes more and more important.
Thank you. Again from Mexico, we've got a question from the Centro Universitario de Tijuana, in the city of Tijuana, in the state of Baja California, in Mexico.
Within postmodernism, what is the role of cost-benefit vis-a-vis risk, whether these are managed with an aesthetic focus or an anti-aesthetic focus?
Nigel, did you understand the question?
I think I understand the question. The question pertains to the role of aesthetics in cost-benefit analysis and its relation to a postmodern theoretical framework. I would have to say that my use of aesthetics comes from a background that is clearly connected to art, which is the traditional understanding of aesthetics. But I use aesthetics to apply in general to all people in the sense that aesthetics is a dimension within which people live their lives. We spend 1/3 of our lives at work. If it has no aesthetic value, then it becomes a very uninspiring place to work. You spend 1/3 of your life there. So the emphasis that I always want to place is how can people learn to love their work? A postmodern organization it's just a theoretical description, basically, between what used to be considered more hierarchic, top-down, one-way types of communication and what are now becoming more understood as networks, flattened hierarchies, and two-way communication. So as far as cost-benefit analysis, I think just an easy way of understanding that is engaging entire teams of people to contribute to development, marketing, theorizing about new products, new services, that type of thing, rather than just sort of running a rigid marketing research survey and then saying, okay, we're going to go with this because that's what the boss says. Cost-benefit analysis has to not just incorporate potential clients and customers, but the internal culture of the organization itself, and how can people be more satisfied aesthetically with getting on board with one particular product or service versus another.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing, because I think the element of the aesthetic quality of work is really important to risk management. And in this context, if you look at Nigel's comments about art in aesthetics, what art does in regards to risk management is to help paint a picture and to create patterns. And it's in those patterns that you'll find analysis and control of risk. So I think that there are some tremendous interplays between the example of aesthetics and art and how we might apply it in risk management.
Our next question is again from Mexico. It's from the Universidad Tecnológico de Tecamachalco, in the city of Tecamachalco, in the state of Puebla, in Mexico.
Good morning. Greetings to all of you. My question is, how do universities in the U.S. do in order to promote creativity and risk-taking? What can you recommend for our students? Taking into account that every activity assumes a risk, we need to understand that this is related to the context of circumstances. Some can be predicted, some cannot. So how can we turn these conditions, this environmental context, into an opportunity? What suggestions do you have for us? Thank you.
Dan?
I'll try to address that. It's a great question, by the way, and I think that there may be some differences between what a university does in the science world versus the liberal art or the social science world, where issues of speech versus research may be more dynamic. But let's just try to encapsulate it on the whole and say that if you're going to undertake risky activities, and we certainly appreciate those qualities at schools and universities, one of the things we have to look for is how redundant and how robust are our capabilities, so that if something doesn't go quite right, we have the ability to recapture that which we have done and to move back towards that nominal line, if you will. And I think that's where I would approach it, is to say, how capable are we of, if things don't go particularly well, we can get back up to some line that is acceptable to us. And that's where I would start the evaluation. If you've got no capability of getting back to the balance point, then maybe that's not an activity. That particular research or that particular project may not be one that you want to undertake.
Our next question is from Panama. It's from the Universidad Tecnológica de Panama in Panama City, Panama.
A greeting from the bridge of the world and the heart of the world. Very often we teach in different seminars at the university about conducting research and studies to evaluate procedures to see if the rates of return are really worth the risk or not. But in reality, this project very often doesn't really reflect, I don't know if it doesn't show that if you can or not take the risk. But the person does take the risk, and it goes a lot better than what the survey could have predicted. So what can you say about this? What other aspects is it that we need to evaluate or assess, because this is reality sometimes? So what do you suggest we should do?
I look at risk in a couple different ways, and it's a wonderful description that you laid out, but there are other elements to risk besides the economic element, the social context, the personal context, the cultural, and they all play into this. And so sooner or later, one of those contexts will benefit from your activities. And that, in essence, may be where the success comes from. Unfortunately, in the business world, we tend to concentrate on the economic piece, but I think all of those contexts are, in the long run, probably equally important.
Nigel, anything you'd like to add?
Well, again, I think Xerox is a good example. The Alto computer that they developed wasn't something that could have been predicted as being successful through traditional marketing research tools, because they would essentially be required to communicate something unknown to a sample group that had no ability to conceptualize that type of product and how it could transform their lives. Even if they came in and sat down at a computer, they would have to take time to envision all of the potential applications that this could have and transform their life over time as it became more and more integrated a technology. So I think things like traditional cost-benefit analysis or social scientific tools are a legitimate tool, but are just a narrow part of the picture when you're thinking, especially when you're dealing with innovative technologies and services.
Thank you. And I think our last question for this session will be from Paraguay. It'll be from the San Juan Bautista Cooperative in Paraguay.
Hola. Del Centro de Estudios Superiores, Provincia Gigante de las Indias, San Juan Bautista de las Misiones,
San Juan Bautista de las Misiones, Paraguay. Heterogeneity of the cultural training of the group of employees of one company. In what way does that affect the management or risk policy of the company?
Did you get the entirety of that question? It sounded like training.
Yes. Well, traditional training procedures are just one aspect of creating a culture. That's, in my mind, that the most important aspect is the larger picture of creating a culture that supports risk. So newsletters, advertisements, traditional forms of information dissemination become important, including trainings themselves. But obviously what you're talking about, when you're talking about management, you're talking about mid to higher level leaders within an organization, and it is incumbent upon an organization to select leaders that are tolerant of or even supportive of risk themselves. Once they then enter an organization where they see their subordinates being creative and coming up with ideas and perhaps being able to delegate and empower responsibilities to those people and having them succeed, that, of course, is going to change their own perceptions and their own sense of self within the organization so that they become then more apt to empower people in the future. Again, I think it's a larger issue of the culture at large, and training seminars are just, again, one aspect of a large strategy.
Thank you for your questions. We will take more questions after the second module, but now let's move to the second module of our program, in which Dan will explore the specifics of different methodologies and models for effective risk-taking.
Thank you very much. It is essential that we bridge the critical historical risk-taking view with elements of day-to-day consideration that will help you as you embark on enhancing risk recognition, as well as managing and integrating risk-taking and developing risk management as part of your organization's culture. It's important, however, to review some of the historical relevance of Nigel Brookes' comments toward highlighting the potential limitations of risk-taking, more specifically, being adverse to risk. Nigel reminded us that an instrument does not make music unless it is played. Likewise, organizations can't grow unless new challenges are undertaken. These challenges will undoubtedly both face and create risk from the human, technical, and natural fronts. If you will, the people, technology, and resources that form the instruments of business. As musicians are capable of trying new ideas, knowing there is a possibility that their musical interpretation will not be appreciated, managers recognize that new endeavors may fail or achieve less success than they envisioned. As with the musician, managers have to make a decision: remain static or forge ahead. Instruments not played in organizations that do not seek to encourage growth, however growth may be defined, can rely on one outcome: no music and no forward movement for their organization. For either, that outcome is typically unacceptable. There is no question that risk-taking has both an art and a science component, though in this discussion we concentrate on the former. The many aspects associated with risk, for the most part, can be identified and further can be controlled. In some cases, elements of risk can be eliminated altogether. Today, we will expand upon the elements of risk, categorize essential considerations in each element, and provide a picture of how we might modify your organizational culture toward risk considerations. If I may, I would like to make just two more introductory comments to complete the bridge from Nigel's presentation to mine. Please keep both of these in mind as the remainder of the presentation unfolds. The first thought is in regards to risk and the impact of risk manifestation. There is an old adage that is as true today as it ever was, and that is, the past is prologue. This quote, or versions of it, can be attributed to many. And what does this have to do with risk? Well, what is essential to consider is that without modifying the factors of risk, we are doomed to have the same results. That is, history will likely repeat itself. On the contrary, if we positively impact the elements of risk, we can change the outcomes in our favor. We become better at playing the instruments of business, and thus our tune and our results are more pleasing. In my university lectures, I frequently invoke a quotation attributed to the great statesman and speaker Winston Churchill. As the stages of the British conflicts of World War II unfolded, Churchill said, "The Americans are a great people. You can always count on them to do the right thing after they've tried everything else." Of course, Churchill was interested in modifying the risks and the outcomes his nation was likely to face if the United States did not join the European theater. His quote has a deeper meaning today and is specifically directed at the topic of this presentation. If we understand what risk is and the consequences of its manifestations, then we must take the appropriate action to manage or eliminate those risks. To not do so acquiesces to attempting a variety of tactics until you happen upon one that works. Happenstance is poor strategy and tactically impossible to implement and further impossible to manage. In Churchill's case, he was referring to the fact that the U.S. had tried diplomacy, economic sanctions, requested political pressures from the Allies, and had threatened military interventions, all before actually sending assets and troops to Europe. Though what the U.S. did may have made some sense to the American people, wishing to avoid conflict at all costs, it delayed the inevitable with tremendous losses in the interim. The same holds true in recognizing and mitigating risks. Build the capability now, or your only choice will be to respond to risk that arises, and your ability to control the outcomes will be limited. Thus, though risk-taking implies just that, it is possible to create a culture of taking risks, wherein the results are hedged in your favor. For the purposes of this presentation, we are integrating the concepts of hazard and risk. Hazards are the inherent quality of a material, a task, or a process to cause harm, while risks are the measure or the magnitude of the outcomes, should the hazards manifest. Some believe that hazard management is the sounder philosophy. Get rid of the hazards, and there is no risk to deal with. The alternate view is to be capable of managing any degree of risk through a combination of personnel, economic, and tactical or relationship strategies. Clearly, both have advantages, and in the real world, most organizations fall somewhere in between, controlling or eliminating some hazards, and developing the ability to respond and further manage those events that do actually take place. Let's consider the introductory comments as a canvas for an artist. Our critical need now is to help the artist, your organization, recognize the subject matter that should be painted on that canvas. Thus, our main subjects are the primary categories of risk. Three major categories, that is, including natural, technical, and man-made risks. Clearly, the ability to recognize where risk emanates will enhance your ability to control those risks. Let's begin to paint the canvas, one risk at a time. You've heard of many natural risks in the past presentations, and many of our countries have suffered from earthquakes, hurricanes, and volcanoes. As technology expands, risks associated grow beyond, in many cases, our abilities to control them. Think, if you will, of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, the Challenger space shuttle, the Red Worm and NIMDA computer viruses, and information security in general. Unfortunately, man-made risk is becoming more critical to understand and to manage all the time. As examples, espionage, violence in the workplace, and terrorism have to be recognized as real and unacceptable. Organizations must be capable of managing the risks associated with each of these, and obviously, we must be capable of reducing risk by mitigating or eliminating the hazards and by responding and managing events effectively. Recent events in the United States have, unfortunately, brought to the international table the potential for hazards unmanaged and the costs of risk regarding terrorism. Our canvas now has the basic subject matter painted in broad strokes, but it is clear that we have to start filling in the background and adding some necessary color. Natural, technical, and man-made risks rarely act unilaterally, and we have shown that relationship in our painting as a Venn diagram. One or more interact almost all of the time, and this overlapping begins to add depth and meaning to our picture. Identifying more discrete concerns within the three primary risk categories creates this depth and adds to the meaning. We can use a risk or threat matrix as a tool to provide more detail to our painting, and the threat matrix demands that, as an organization, your management team sit down and attempt to identify all of the risks within each of the threat categories. As you can see, the lists become quite long. Artist would neither include nor exclude elements that will diminish the value of your work. What this means practically is that your threat assessments should be detailed enough to truly identify risks that can impact your organization. And by doing so, the strategies and tactics you employ as you undertake risk can be modified or managed accordingly. Often, the risk-taking strategy will be to avoid certain risks, while in other cases, steps will be taken to modify the risk before actually engaging it. I'll expand on this tactic in a few minutes. From a systems perspective, or if we look at your organizations holistically, we must identify risks that come from both internal and external sources. By doing so, we continue to build the background of our picture. In fact, systems thinking demands that we look at risk from wherever it may emanate. Risk-taking will be impossible to manage if we focus on only one of the sources. By recognizing natural, technical, and man-made risks that come from internal and external sources, our strategies for managing risk-taking become much more clear. What strategies am I referring to? These include risk elimination, risk modification, and risk shielding. Let's discuss each in a bit more detail. There are two elimination strategies I would like to discuss. In one, the implication is simply that there are some risks not worth taking. The decision not to move forward with a risky endeavor may come from the investment required to take that risk, or the decision may be based on other unacceptable outcomes. In the second strategy, risk elimination refers to the preemptive step of eliminating operational risks that may harm your organization. The latter only works, though, if you have options for having such risky operations done by others. You may recall from the ITC's last program on the topic of risk management, John Watson discussed the tactic of risk transfer, and in essence, that is what I am referring to. Within the art and culture of risk-taking, deciding on what activities to embark upon, then, is just as important on who conducts the activity. In risk modification, you should seek to moderate risk through changes in operations or in processes, materials, and in people. The essence of risk modification is not that you abandon a particular risk, but rather you change its dynamics such that the activity is still beneficial and the negative consequences are reduced to acceptable levels. In most cases, risk modification applies to risk that emanates from internal sources. Risk shielding has both a physical and operational aspect, as shielding is focused mainly on external threats. Where a particular task or operation is essential to your business, and where there is known risk, you can still succeed by segregating your organization from the risk physically. In addition, you may find it necessary to shield yourself from operational risks, say from a supplier of goods and or services that may cause harm to your organization. Separating people from hazardous activities highlights simply the first example, while restricting relationships with suppliers who violate child labor laws serves as an example of the second. You might ask, what am I shielding myself from in the child labor law example? Great question, and a very good time to highlight the fact that not all risk results in physical damage to assets or people. Some risk results in damaged reputations and legal scrutiny, both of which negatively impact operations. In risk-taking, another essential capability must be to not only recognize when a threat is imminent, but to be able to respond appropriately and within time frames that will reduce the ultimate impact. Organizations that are capable of rapid response and recovery fare much better in the face of adversity. The art of risk-taking demands that an organization be prepared to respond to any event, and this cannot be effectively done by shirt-sleeve methodologies. As we continue to paint the background of our risk-taking picture, responding and recovering from an event requires a systematic incorporation of three specific elements. First, a systematic response to an event requires the incorporation of appropriate resources. The implication here is that, as an organization, you have conducted an assessment of risk that you may face, and that you have procured the resources needed to effect the best response possible. A simple example may be having enough fire extinguishers available in the event of a fire. A more complicated example is prearranging aircraft to ship supplies and generators to your operations in the event of a major natural disaster. More complicated yet is assuring that your aircraft has a runway to land on. You must also incorporate essential personnel into your response protocols. Regardless of efforts, my experience suggests that those capable of leading an organization through a disaster or tragedy are few and far between. If your essential personnel travel or may not be available in the event of a critical situation, you must expand your pool of essential and capable personnel. Lastly, your response efforts must incorporate the community at large. Many organizations attempt to retain all response capabilities within, but depending on the nature of the event, community resources are essential. Such may be the case in a natural, technical, or man-made scenario. A perfect example of incorporating these essential elements into your response methodologies is to examine what is known as the Standardized Emergency Management System, or SEMS. SEMS is a response and recovery methodology utilized by police, fire, and emergency response officials to coordinate their efforts in times of disasters, crises, or certain types of emergencies. The SEMS methodology is an integrated system of response focusing on 4 elements. This includes personnel, financial, logistics, and planning elements. The glue that holds this approach together is an Emergency Management Operations Center, or EOC. Though it may not be necessary for you to have an EOC or specifically delineate the personnel, financial, logistics, and planning elements during your event responses, the SEMS approach is a sound one to consider. SEMS is inherently systemic. That is, no manager, department, or organization can be a response island unto themselves. In most cases, this is important. The advantages in adopting a SEMS-like methodology is that your organization will acquire and train the appropriate response personnel, create critical logistical relationships, have the financial resources available to overcome an event, and develop the capabilities and plan and implement an event response. As far as painting our picture goes, SEMS is adding highlights and splashes of color to our background. To the untrained eye, our risk-taking picture is becoming infinitely clear. The reason for this clarity is simply that we have moved from theory and abstract views to concrete, recognizable ones. The relevancy of topics such as threat identification, risk elimination, modification and shielding, as well as a systematic risk response capability, rests within optimizing risk-taking. One benefit is that, as an organization, you may be able to expand your risk considerations. That is, undertake activities you might not have in the past. Another benefit is that if a particular risk were to manifest itself, your response and recovery efforts could be compressed, getting you back in the productive mode much more quickly. It is clear that some risks have to be taken to achieve growth, enter new markets, remain competitive, and remain a player in what has become a world economy. Through the recognition and management of risks, you can further optimize your chances of success. This demands that you be capable of two things. The first is recognizing the risks that you may face now. The second is developing the ability to recognize the risks that you are likely to face. To do either is so fundamentally important that the capability must become part of the fabric of your organization. The time, personnel, and resources must be allocated to constantly analyze risk that exist in the present and that may exist in the future. One way to build this capability is to borrow from the field of enterprise risk management. Though many papers and perspectives have been written on the benefits and challenges of enterprise risk management, what we can gain from it is a more detailed categorization of those business elements that we must evaluate in order to identify current and potential risks. Let's go back to the picture we are painting, as we have a bit more work to do. Some final shading, some highlights and detail work, if you will. We've identified the fact that risks emanate from internal and external sources, and that those sources have become an essential element of our painting. We will benefit, however, from identifying more discreetly risk categories and some of the considerations within each category. Enterprise risk professionals think of risk in financial, hazard, strategic, and operational terms. From the internal perspective, financial risks may include the availability of capital and asset values, while from the external view, market risks for publicly traded organizations are a primary consideration. Hazard risks, for many, are a little easier to perceive. From the internal view, worker concerns, such as injuries and illnesses, are primary, as are general liability risks. Legal considerations are paramount from the external perspective, while disasters are risks pertinent to both internal and external concern. Internal strategic risks include the allocation and protection of research and development, while external risks include your customer base. For example, is your customer base dwindling, and do you know why? Have you identified potential new customers, or do you really know who your competitors are and what they are sharing with your customers? Another external strategic risk is the alliances you have entered or are considering. A critical question to ask is, what happens to your revenue streams or your reputation if an organization you are allied with ceases operations or is implicated in a scandal? Lastly, operational risks, though we think we know them well, must be further analyzed. Internal operational risks might include management and retention, and your information systems and capabilities. Externally, it is important to consider operational risks as well, such as your supply chains, the regulatory environment, and the factors that may increase the potential for business interruption. Of course, there are many other internal and external risks that are inherent to your specific operations. Strategically, This is where you would expand the threat or risk matrix. And by doing so, what do you accomplish? As an artist, your picture would be better appreciated by the masses. But as a business person, your ability to identify, mitigate, and respond to risks that you face will be greatly improved. I often say in my classes that you cannot control that which you do not identify. Although simplistic, the statement reiterates the value of risk identification, and in risk-taking, we must know what we are facing to optimize our efforts. Let's pull together the important topics of today and add the final brushstrokes to our risk-taking artwork. What we need is a methodology which can incorporate the majority of what we have discussed: risk identification, risk categorization, risk control strategy,